People who live deep in Appalachian country will tell you the same thing if you get them talking. You learn real fast what belongs out there and what doesn't. Animals know it. Dogs know it. Kids know it before adults teach it out of them. These folks learned it the hard way. Welcome back to Park Ranger Files, and thank you for everyone who keeps sending these in. Story 1. My dad worked the coal yards his whole adult life, and he was not a man who scared easy. That's not me building him up the way sons sometimes do when they talk about their fathers. It was a simple observable fact about him that everyone who knew him would have confirmed without hesitation. He had a very high threshold for concern and an even higher one for fear. I watched him once, when I was maybe 8 years old, pull a cottonmouth out of our crawl space with a broom handle, take it out to the creek, and drop it in without any particular change in his expression. He didn't run. He didn't swear. He walked back inside and washed the broom handle and put it away. He was that kind of man. Methodical, unimpressed by things that alarmed most people, constitutionally inclined to find a practical solution and move toward it without wasting a lot of energy on reaction first. So when he told me the story, I absorbed it differently than I would have absorbed it coming from someone else. I took it at face value because he was not the kind of man to tell stories for effect, and he was not the kind of man who imagined things. This was sometime in the mid-90s. He was never specific about which year when he retold it, and he only retold it twice in my hearing. Once when I was 17 and once when I was in my mid-20s, the second time at my request. The two tellings were nearly identical, which I always took as a mark of truth. People who make things up tend to add to them over time. He never added anything. The night it happened, he was driving home from a double shift at the coal yards, probably somewhere between 1:30 and 2 in the morning. Those double shifts were brutal. 16 hours minimum, usually more. And by the end of them, he'd be moving on something closer to instinct than active thought. He knew the route home so well he could have driven it half unconscious, which he'd done more than once over the years. But that night, instead of taking the longer route around the ridge, the one that kept him on paved roads the whole way, he decided to cut through on Sawmill Road. Sawmill Road is not an official name, just what people in that part of Letcher County called it, because there'd been a sawmill operation at the head of it sometime before living memory. It's a gravel two-track that runs maybe 4 miles through heavy timber before it comes back out at the state route on the other side of a long ridge. No houses on it, no pull-offs to speak of. No lighting of any kind except what you bring with you. In daylight, it's a shortcut that saves maybe 15 minutes. At night, without a good reason to be on it, most people left it alone. My father had used it in daylight plenty of times and had used it at night maybe twice before, both times without incident. He was comfortable with it the way he was comfortable with everything. Not careless, just accustomed. He said he was 1.5 miles in, roughly the halfway point, when he came around a curve in the road and had to slow down hard because there was something in the headlights ahead. He thought at first it was a deer. Then as the distance closed, he thought maybe somebody's dog, one of the big ones people kept out that way for hunting. But as he got closer still, it was clearly a person standing in the middle of the road facing him. A woman, he thought. He said he was never entirely certain about that because he couldn't see her face clearly at that distance, and her clothing was loose. A long dark coat or dress, he thought. Something that didn't help him read her shape. She was standing directly in the center of the road, facing toward him, with her arms at her sides. She had no light source, no flashlight, no phone, no lantern, nothing that reflected back at him. Which meant that before he'd come around that curve, she'd been standing in total darkness, facing down an unlit gravel road in the middle of the night with nothing to see by. He brought the truck to a stop. He said he was probably 30 yards from her at that point, close enough that the headlights were hitting her fully, and he sat and waited for her to do something. Step to the side, wave him down, shield her eyes from the glare, anything. She didn't. She stood with her arms at her sides and she didn't move, and she didn't react to the lights in any way that he could detect. He said it was like looking at something that had been placed there, rather than something that had arrived there. He sat and waited. He put a number on it later, about 30 seconds, maybe a little more. Then he tapped the horn. Just a brief tap, enough to signal his presence without being aggressive about it. She didn't move. He rolled his window down, called out, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" He said his voice sounded strange to him in the quiet of those trees, like it went out and didn't come back. There was no answer and no movement. He sat with the window down for another stretch, listening. No wind in the trees, no insects, nothing from her. Just the sound of the engine idling and the headlights holding her in place in the middle of the road. He told me that the longer he sat there, the worse he felt about the situation, but not in any way he could put direct language to. Not afraid exactly, not alarmed in a way that had a specific reason attached to it, just wrong. The whole scene was wrong in a way that went beyond a woman standing on a gravel road at 2 a.m, which was already wrong enough. It was something about how she was standing. He'd seen frightened people, injured people, confused people, lost people. He'd been in a coal operation long enough to see all of those. This was none of those. This was something that had positioned itself. That was the word he used both times he told the story. Positioned. Like she had moved to that spot deliberately and with a specific purpose, and she was now waiting for what that purpose required to happen next. And what it required was him getting out of the truck. He didn't get out of the truck. He put it in reverse. He said he didn't make a decision, not consciously, not with any internal debate. He just put the truck in reverse and started backing. Slowly at first, because the road was narrow, and he needed to stay in the 2 tracks, but steadily. He backed around the curve he'd come around so she was out of his sight. Then he backed faster. He said he reversed for the entire remaining 1.5 miles to the state route, never turning around, just going backward in the dark with nothing but his reverse lights to see by, and it took him close to 10 minutes. And there were 2 or 3 moments where the rear wheels went close to the edge of the road and his stomach dropped. But he didn't stop and he didn't turn around. When he got back to the pavement, he sat with the engine running and the heat on. It wasn't cold that time of year, but he had it on anyway. And he sat until his hands stopped shaking. He'd noticed a shaking somewhere in the middle of the reversing and had found it strange, the disconnection between his hands and the rest of him, the way his body had registered something that his mind was still catching up to. He drove the long way home. He checked the rearview mirror every few seconds for the entire drive, which he acknowledged was not rational since there was nothing following him, and the road was empty, but he checked it anyway. He didn't tell my mother that night. He came home and went to bed and didn't bring it up at breakfast and didn't mention it for years. The first time he told me was when I was 17, and I'd mentioned to him that a friend and I were thinking about taking Sawmill Road at night as a shortcut home from somewhere we'd been. He told me the story instead of just saying, "Don't do that," which I think was intentional. He wanted me to understand the reason rather than just follow the instruction. He wasn't a man who gave instructions without reasons. I asked him afterward whether he thought she was real. He considered it for a while, the way he considered everything, not performing the consideration, but actually doing it. Then he said he didn't know what the word real meant in that situation. He knew what he had seen. He knew it didn't fit into any framework he'd built in 50 years of living in those mountains and working in operations where unusual things happened regularly and always had explanations. And he knew with more certainty than he'd felt about most things that staying on that road would have been the wrong choice. He also told me something about the stroller that he didn't include the first time he told the story and that he added when I asked him about it when I was older. He said the stroller was what finally resolved his understanding of what he was looking at. At the distance he was at when he first stopped, the family in the road looked strange, but not impossible. A woman and a man and a child in a stroller walking a country road at 2 in the morning. Strange by any normal standard, genuinely alarming. But there was a framework of explanation available. Lost, confused, car broken down further up the road, any number of things. The stroller was what his mind tried to fit into that framework and couldn't, because the stroller was empty. He could see that clearly in the headlights. And you don't push an empty stroller 4 miles down a lightless gravel road in the middle of the night. That's not part of any framework of reasonable explanation. The empty stroller was the thing that didn't fit. And when it didn't fit, the rest of the scene stopped fitting too. And that's when the reversal happened. We moved out of the county when I was 16. I'm in my 30s now, and I drive through that part of Kentucky maybe once a year. I've never taken Sawmill Road at night. I've barely taken it in daylight. That specific mile and a half of gravel through heavy timber doesn't feel like a shortcut anymore. It feels like something with a door in it, and my father happened to approach that door from the outside and had the presence of mind to back away. Story 2. I managed a small self-storage facility for just under 3 years, from the time I was 24 until I was 27. It was a family-owned operation. Had been in the same family for almost 30 years before I came on. And the family still owned it while I worked there, they just weren't present most days. I was the on-site person. The facility itself was modest. 62 units in 4 rows, a small brick office building at the entrance, with a window that looked out over the first row. A security camera system that covered the gate and the main 2 rows but left the back row largely unwatched. A keypad-controlled entrance gate, a bathroom I shared with no one, a space heater I used from October through April, and a radio I kept tuned to a country station out of Harlan. 1 person on site at a time. Quiet work. I read more books in those 3 years than I'd read in the decade before. The facility sat on a rural highway between 2 communities, about 12 miles apart, in a stretch of the county where the terrain starts to rise toward the ridge and the road follows a creek. Normal rural landscape. Nothing about the location felt unusual. Most of our renters were regular people storing ordinary things, furniture between moves, seasonal equipment, the overflow of accumulation that every household eventually produces. I knew most of them by name and by vehicle, and on quiet days I could look out my window and tell you who was on the property without checking the log. Long-term renters are like that. They become part of the rhythm of the place. Unit 4 was a long-term renter. Had been one for nearly a decade before I started, based on the payment records I inherited when I took the job. The records showed consistent payment every month. Cash, sent by mail in a plain white envelope, never late, never short, always exact. There was a name in the folder, a full name, written in the handwriting of the manager who'd been there before me. Below the name was a Georgia address, also handwritten, on an index card that had been taped to the inside of the folder at some point and never removed. My first week on the job, I tried to update the contact records for all our long-term renters. Get phone numbers, email addresses, make the files current. For most renters, this was straightforward. For Unit 4, I came up empty. The name in the file didn't return any results in the kind of searches I could do at the time. The Georgia address, when I sent a letter to it, came back about 3 weeks later marked undeliverable, address not found. I flagged it in the system as a contact information gap and made a note to follow up. And then the daily work of running the facility took over, and I didn't think about it much again for a while. The unit itself is in the middle of the back row, away from the office and away from the cameras. I walked past it during my rounds, which I did twice a day. The padlock on Unit 4 was consistent. An older style, a little oxidized on the shackle, nothing distinctive, always in place and locked. The door seal looked undisturbed. I never saw the door open, never saw anyone approach it, never noticed any sign of recent use. For a storage unit that had been rented and paid for continuously for nearly a decade, it had the quality of something forgotten rather than something being maintained. There was a smell, though. Not strong, not something that hit you from a distance, but something you noticed if you slowed down near that unit during your rounds. I tried to pin it down for a while, and eventually landed on wet concrete as the closest comparison, with something underneath that I never managed to name. Something that reminded me of very old basements and the kind of chill that doesn't leave certain buildings no matter what season it is. I mentioned it once to the owner of the facility, who came by every couple of weeks to check in and collect paperwork. He said the unit had flooded during a heavy rain a few years before I started, and they'd had ongoing moisture issues in that section of the back row ever since. He didn't seem concerned. I took it at face value. Nothing happened for my first year and a half. The rent kept coming. The unit stayed locked. I kept walking past it twice a day and not thinking about it much. Then one night in January, deep winter, about an hour after my normal closing time, I'd stayed late because there had been a billing discrepancy I wanted to sort out before I left. The gate alarm went off. We had a sensor connected to the entrance gate that sent an alert to my phone and triggered an audible tone in the office whenever the gate opened outside of business hours. When the alarm tripped, I checked the camera feed on the office monitor, which showed the gate area in the first row. The gate was closed. Nothing was moving in the camera's field of view. I assumed it was a false trigger from the cold, affecting the sensor, and reset it, made a note in the log, and went back to the billing paperwork. 20 minutes later, the alarm went off again. Identical result, camera showing nothing, gate closed, no movement visible. At that point, I put on my coat and went out to check in person. The gate was fine. The lock was intact, the latch was set, nothing had disturbed it. I walked the front 2 rows slowly with my flashlight, checked the few units in those rows that had active renters, checked the fence line on both sides. Everything was where it was supposed to be. I was about to go back in when I decided I'd walk the back row too, just for completeness, even though the likelihood of finding anything there was low and the cold was getting uncomfortable. I got to the back row and walked it. 3rd unit from the end, I swept the flashlight across the door and stopped. Unit 4's padlock was on the ground. It was sitting directly in front of the door, upright, as if it had been set down deliberately and carefully rather than dropped or knocked off. The hasp on the door was still in place. The door was not open. Nothing was visibly disturbed about the door itself. The lock had simply been removed from the hasp and placed on the ground in front of the unit. I stood there for a while, long enough to be sure I was seeing what I was seeing and not making an error based on bad light or cold-induced inattention. The lock was on the ground. The door was closed and the hasp was in place and the lock was on the ground. I took my phone out and called the owner. He answered after a few rings, sounding like he'd been up rather than asleep. I told him what I was looking at. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said to use the spare lock from the cabinet in the office, secure the door, document everything in the log, and not to open the unit. I started to ask why not. My instinct was strongly toward opening it, because a padlock doesn't remove itself, and whatever had removed it might still be on the premises. And he said again, just the spare lock and the log, and that he'd come by in the morning. There was something in how he said it. Not dismissive, more like he was being careful, like he'd thought about this scenario before and had already worked out what the right response was. I photographed the padlock where it sat on the ground, photographed the door and hasp, got the spare lock from the office cabinet, secured the unit, and logged the whole thing with timestamps. Then I went home. I came back in the morning at 7:30 to open, and the owner's truck was already in the lot. He was standing at the back row when I parked. I walked back there and found him looking at Unit 4. The original padlock was back on the door. Same padlock, same oxidized shackle, sitting in the hasp, exactly as it had sat every morning for the year and a half I've been walking past it. Locked. The spare lock I'd put on the night before was sitting on the ground in front of the door. In exactly the same position, the same careful upright placement that I'd found the original lock in the night before. The owner stood there looking at it for a while without saying anything. Then he picked up the spare lock and handed it to me, and told me the unit's renter would be by sometime soon to deal with it. I asked when he'd last seen the renter. He didn't answer that directly. He said the rent came in reliably, and that some renters were more private than others, and that the unit had always been current, so there hadn't been occasion to make contact. He said it in the tone of someone reciting a position rather than sharing a thought. I gave my 2 weeks' notice that afternoon. I told him I had a family situation that required me to leave the area, which was not true. He thanked me, asked me to train whoever came next, and said he hoped things worked out with the family situation. He did not ask about the lock. He did not try to address what we'd both looked at that morning. The absence of any attempt to explain it was in some ways more unsettling than the thing itself. Before I left, I went back and looked at the access log for the facility going back several years. Every unit with an active renter had at least occasional entries in the log for access, people going in and out at various times. Unit 4 had no entries, not low entries, no entries. For the entire period the log covered, which went back 9 years before my tenure started, there was not a single recorded instance of Unit 4's door being accessed by anyone. 9 years of consistent monthly rent for a storage unit that no one ever opened. The facility is still operating. The sign is the same. The gate is the same. I don't know what's in Unit 4, and I don't know who the name on the index card belongs to, and I don't know how a padlock removes itself and replaces itself in a locked facility on a winter night. I stopped looking for an answer to any of those questions sometime in the year after I left. Some gaps are not asking to be filled. They're asking to be left alone. Story 3. My grandmother lived alone at the end of a holler in McDowell County for 32 years. From the time my grandfather died in 1987 until she passed in 2019 at 91 years old. She lived in the same house she'd lived in since she married my grandfather in 1951. A 2-bedroom frame house set back from a dirt road with a long covered porch across the front, and a garden that she kept working until she was in her late 80s. She knew that house, and that holler the way you can only know a place you've spent 70 years inside of. Every sound the structure made, every patch of yard, every neighbor's routine, every seasonal change in the forest that pressed in on 3 sides. She was sharp right until the last year or so. No dementia, no significant confusion. She did her own books into her late 80s, drove herself to church and to the grocery until she was 87, had opinions about current events, and expressed them clearly. She was a woman who had lived a long life in difficult circumstances, the coal camp poverty of mid-century McDowell County, a husband whose health was broken by underground work before he turned 60, 3 children raised mostly on her own determination, and she had come out of all of that with a mind like a blade and a manner that didn't waste words. She told me the story when I was about 10 years old, just the once. We were sitting on her porch on a summer afternoon shelling beans into a big colander between us, and she started telling it the way older people sometimes begin things, without preamble, like she'd been carrying the thought for a while and had finally decided to set it down. I didn't interrupt her, and I didn't ask questions while she was talking. I just listened and shelled beans and absorbed it. She said that when she was young, around 8 or 9 years old, she thought, though she wasn't certain of the exact year, there was a man in that holler that everybody called the Brush Man. She was careful to clarify that this wasn't his name. It was what people in the community called him when they spoke of him among themselves, and it had been what they called him for long enough that nobody she'd talked to as a child could say who had started it or what the original reason was. It just fit him in some way that people seemed to agree on, without needing to explain to each other. He lived further up the mountain, above the last house in the holler, in a dwelling that wasn't visible from any road. The trees were thick up in that direction, and the terrain was steep, and the path to his place wasn't something you came across by accident. You'd have to know it was there to find it. He came down from the mountain every few weeks to trade goods or to make the trip to the nearest town for supplies. By all appearances, he was quiet and solitary, the kind of man who existed in close communities in those mountains, without causing friction simply by not inserting himself into anything. He didn't have a reputation for violence. He didn't have a reputation for dishonesty. He paid fair for what he bought, and he delivered what he traded for, and he kept to himself. But there was a rule about him that the adults of that holler had passed down to the children in the community, and they had passed it down without a lot of explanation attached to it. Just the rule itself, stated as a fact, and expected to be followed. You did not speak to him. You did not make eye contact with him. If you were walking and you saw him coming toward you on the road, you crossed to the opposite side, and you kept your eyes pointed at the ground in front of your feet, and you kept walking at a steady pace until he had passed you and you could not hear his footsteps anymore. My grandmother said she'd been given this rule before she was old enough to fully understand what rules were, and she had followed it without question for the same reason children follow rules when they can sense, even without language to describe it, that the rule has real weight. She didn't find it strange or frightening to follow. She just followed it. Several of the children she grew up with in that holler had been given the same rule, and they all followed it the same way, without discussing it much among themselves, because there wasn't much to discuss. It was just how things were with the brush man. One afternoon in October, when the leaves had mostly come down and the ridge above the holler was showing its bones through the bare timber, my grandmother was walking home from a friend's house, about a mile and a half away. She'd made the walk dozens of times. She knew every section of that road. She came around a bend and found herself face to face with the situation the rule existed for. The brush man was coming down from the direction of his mountain, walking the same road in the opposite direction. The distance between them was maybe 50 feet. She did what she'd been taught. She crossed immediately to the far side of the road and put her eyes on the dirt in front of her boots and continued walking at the same pace she'd been walking. Not faster, not slower. The rule didn't say to run, and she didn't run. She focused on her feet and on the road, and she breathed through her nose. She could hear him on the gravel. His footsteps were regular and unhurried, coming toward her at the same pace he'd apparently been walking when she'd first seen him. She kept her eyes down. She counted her own steps the way she said she sometimes did on long walks when she wanted something to think about that wasn't the distance. When he was closest to her, when he was passing her on the opposite side of the road, maybe 6 or 8 feet from where she was walking, she felt a pressure in both ears at the same moment. She said it was like the sensation you get when you go over a high mountain pass in a car and the altitude change catches your inner ear. A sudden internal pressure that builds and holds rather than releasing. She said it pressed in and held for the entire time it took her to walk past him. And it didn't release when he passed behind her. It held for another minute or more as she continued down the road with her eyes on the ground. And at the same moment that pressure began, she heard him say something, low and close, though she couldn't have been right beside him, because she was on the far side of the road. She said it wasn't loud enough to make out words. It was more like the shape of words, the cadence of speech, something that had the form of language, but that she couldn't bring into focus. She said it was also, and she paused here when she said this, searching for the right description, it was also lower than a normal voice. Not low the way some men speak low, but low in a way she didn't have a framework for. She kept walking. She kept her eyes down. She did not look up. She counted her steps and breathed through her nose and held to the rule the way you hold to a rope in current. She said there was a pull, a very specific pull on her attention, the kind that isn't curiosity so much as compulsion, not wanting to look, but feeling like something was working to make her look. She resisted it, She walked and she counted and she breathed. She didn't look up. Eventually, she could no longer hear his footsteps on the gravel behind her. She waited until she'd counted 50 more of her own steps, and then she ran the rest of the way home. She told her mother what had happened that evening. She described the pressure in her ears and the sound he'd made, trying to be as precise as she could. Her mother listened to all of it without speaking. Then she went still in the way my grandmother described as a particular kind of still. Not the stillness of calm, but the stillness of someone deciding how much to say. She asked my grandmother one question. What did the sound remind you of? My grandmother started to answer, and her mother said, "That's enough," with a finality that wasn't sharp, but that made very clear the conversation was over. Her mother never mentioned it again. Never brought it up in all the years my grandmother was growing up in that house. Not when the brush man passed through the community, not when he stopped coming down from the mountain, not at any point before or after. My grandmother said she had eventually accepted that there were things her mother understood about that place, and about the brush man specifically, that she had decided her daughter didn't need to carry. Later in life, my grandmother told me something else about that afternoon. She said what she heard was not a voice in the way a person's voice is a voice. It was a sound that had the structure of language, that moved the way language moves, that had the rhythm and the cadence of words and sequence. But that was also something that language isn't. She said it was like the idea of words rather than words themselves. She said it was like hearing the intention behind speech without the speech. And she said she thought what he was saying was an invitation, not to her specifically. The same invitation he extended every time he passed someone on that road. An invitation to look up. The rule told you not to look up, and she didn't look up. And that's all she could tell me about why she was sitting there at 90 years old telling me the story instead of something else happening to her on that road 60 years ago. The brush man stopped coming down from the mountain sometime in the early 1950s. Nobody marked the change with any kind of formal acknowledgement. He just stopped appearing on the road during his usual intervals. And after a few months, people noticed the absence, and after a few more months, it became the new normal. No one went up to check on him. No one filed anything with any authority. My grandmother said the feeling among the adults in the holler, as best she could read it then, and in retrospect, was something close to relief. Like a thing they'd been accommodating for a long time, had decided on its own to be accommodated no more. She handed me a fresh bowl of unshelled beans after she finished, and we sat there together in the afternoon sun and worked through them. She didn't seem distressed by the telling. She said it the way she said most things. Clearly without drama as a fact she was reporting. I think she told it to me at 10 years old because she thought I was old enough to hold it and because she decided it was worth passing on. Not as a warning exactly. More as information about the nature of the place and the kind of things that can exist in deep mountain country that don't have names or explanations, but that the people who live close to them learn, generation to generation, how to navigate. My grandmother lived to 91, and she never went back to that subject again. She'd said what she'd decided to say, and that was the extent of it. I'm grateful she said it at all. Story 4. This happened 2 summers ago, and I've been turning it over in my head with the specific patient frustration of someone who can't stop looking for an explanation that isn't there. I've tried every angle I can think of, and I keep arriving back at the same place, which is that there isn't one. So I'm writing it down and sending it in because holding onto it by myself isn't doing me any good. I live in a rural part of Ashe County on a private gravel road that serves maybe 8 houses spread out over something like 1.5 miles. It's the kind of neighborhood, and I use that word loosely given the distances involved, where people know each other the way people know each other, when they're the only 8 households in a defined space. You know, what everyone drives. You know, roughly when people leave for work and when they get home. You know which dogs belong to which properties and which ones tend to get out. When something unfamiliar comes up the road, it gets noticed because the road doesn't go anywhere. It terminates at a turnaround by a creek at the far end and then comes back. Anyone using it either lives here or took a wrong turn somewhere, and the signs on the county road are good enough that wrong turns are genuinely uncommon. I was working from home that summer and had gotten into a habit of checking the mail around noon. Walk 40 feet to the mailbox, get the mail, maybe sit on the porch for a few minutes, then go back inside. It was a Tuesday in mid-July, hot but not unbearable. I walked out to the mailbox, and as I got to it, I noticed someone on the opposite side of the road, about 30 feet down. A man standing on the road shoulder facing my house, not at me, at the house. The way someone looks at a view or a painting, taking it in at a remove. He was maybe 50 years old, heavy-set in a solid rather than unhealthy way, wearing blue jeans and a dark flannel shirt. His hair was shorter and going gray. There was nothing about his clothing or his appearance that registered as unusual for this part of the county. But there was no vehicle anywhere on the road in either direction that I could see, which on a dead-end road with nowhere to walk from except the county road a mile and a half away was notable. I got my mail out of the box and said, "Hey, the way you do out here when you encounter someone in your general vicinity." He turned from looking at the house and looked at me, and he said, "Hey," back, and then after the briefest pause, he said, "How long have you been in this house?" Not phrased as a casual question, phrased as a question he wanted an answer to. I told him about 3 years, which was accurate. He nodded. It was a slow and deliberate nod, the kind that means someone is processing new information against existing information. He looked back at the house once and then back at me, and he said, "Did they tell you about the family before you?" I told him no, that I'd bought the property from an estate sale, that I'd worked with a realtor who hadn't mentioned any notable history, that the inspection had been standard. I was giving him more of an explanation than his question required, I noticed, which was a sign that the question had landed with more weight than a stranger's question should have. He nodded again. Same slow processing nod. And then he said, "Probably better," and he turned and walked away down the road, toward the turnaround at the creek. I stood at my mailbox and watched him go. He walked at a normal pace, unhurried, not looking back. He went around the bend toward the turnaround and was out of my sight. I stood there for a moment and then went inside and called my neighbor Donna, who lives 2 houses down and works from home most days and tends to notice things on the road. I asked her if she'd seen a heavy-set man in a flannel shirt walking the road that morning or the day before. She said she hadn't seen anyone she didn't recognize in at least a week. I got in my car about 15 minutes later and drove down to the turnaround. There was nobody there. No car in the turnaround or anywhere along the road. The turnaround itself is a small flat area at the edge of the creek, and the creek banks at that point are steep mud with exposed roots. If someone had gone down to the creek, you'd see the disturbance in the bank, and there was none. There was nowhere for him to have gone except back up the road, and I hadn't passed him on the road, and Donna hadn't seen him. I spent several evenings over the following weeks going through property history for this address. County records, deed history, old newspaper archives, the kind of research you can do from a laptop if you're patient. I found what I was looking for about 3 weeks in. There was a family here before the estate sale. The estate sale happened because there was no living family member left to inherit. The reason for that is documented in a newspaper article from 2009, not a long article, not a prominent one. The kind of small-town tragedy that gets a few paragraphs in the regional paper and then recedes. I am not going to describe the content of that article in detail here. What I will say is that it was not an accident, and it was not a natural cause, and it was not a single event. It was something that happened over time within this property, and the people involved were not strangers to each other, and the person who was ultimately responsible for it is no longer alive to be held accountable. I don't know who that man was. I don't know how he knew the history of this address, or why he thought I should know that he knew it, or what his connection to the previous family might have been. I don't know how he left a dead-end road without a vehicle, or without being seen by me or by anyone else on the road that afternoon. I still live in the house. I'm not going to be moved by something I can't explain. But I check the road before I walk to the mailbox now, every single time. And if I see someone on the other side of the road facing the house, I'm going back inside before I do anything else. Probably better, he said. I've thought about that a lot. We're going to keep going, but real quick. If you're enjoying this and you're new here, hit subscribe and drop a comment with where you're from. A lot of you are going to be from the same counties, the same hollows, maybe even the same roads as some of these folks. And there's something to knowing that. You're not the only one who's had an experience out there that didn't have a clean explanation. All right, back to it. Story 5. I worked seasonal positions with the Forest Service for several years, before I got my first permanent posting, which meant I spent the better part of my mid-20s moving between districts, living out of a duffel bag for 6-month stretches, learning terrain the way you can only learn it when it's your job to walk through it every single day. I did stints in 3 different states before I settled into something longer term, and each district had its own character, its own rhythms, its own collection of institutional knowledge that got passed around in break rooms and on tailgate lunches, and sometimes not at all. One of my earlier seasons was on a small district in the Cherokee National Forest in Tennessee. I'm going to be deliberately vague about which district and which station, because some of the people I worked alongside during that season are still with the Forest Service, and I don't want to drop anything into their professional lives that they didn't agree to be associated with. What I'm about to describe is not in any report I filed during or after that season. I'm describing it now because enough years have passed that it feels safe to describe it, and because I've carried it around long enough that putting it down somewhere feels like the right thing to do. Part of the job on that district involved overnight stays at a remote ranger station during extended patrol assignments. There were 2 small satellite stations on the district. Simple buildings, functional but not comfortable. Bunk room with 2 cots, bathroom with a shower that worked unreliably, small kitchen with a 2-burner propane stove, and a refrigerator that hummed louder at night than seemed strictly necessary, a table for paperwork, a radio setup, a wood stove for heat. The station I was assigned to for overnight stretches during that season was one the district staff called the back station. It had been there a long time. The logs in the walls had that darkness that comes from decades of wood smoke and weather, and the floors had settled in a way that made certain paths through the rooms feel like memory rather than intention. Old buildings and isolated places have a quality that's hard to describe precisely, but that you recognize when you're in one. A kind of accumulated weight, like the structure has absorbed every storm in every season and every person who passed through it, and you're just the latest entry in a long record. I'd done 2 uneventful overnights at the back station before the one I'm going to tell you about. Went out for a patrol stretch, came back in the late afternoon, made something on the propane stove, did paperwork, went to sleep, got up and did it again. The building was quiet in the ways old buildings in the backcountry are quiet, and all of those sounds became familiar enough by the second overnight that I was sleeping through them without any trouble. The third overnight, I went to bed around 10. I'd had a long patrol day, significant elevation change, and my legs were done. I was asleep quickly and I was sleeping well, which is probably why the change registered the way it did. Not as a sound that woke me, but as an absence of the right sounds, a shift in the texture of the building's nighttime noise that my sleeping brain flagged as wrong before I was conscious enough to identify what had changed. I lay in the bunk with my eyes open for a moment, and then I realized what it was. The radio in the next room was on. Not loud, just on. audible through the wall as static and intermittent transmission noise, the kind of thing that happens with mountain radios when the terrain bounces signals in from unexpected directions. It wasn't alarming by itself, but then underneath the static, I heard what I can only describe as breathing. Not a burst of it, not a fragment that faded. Continuous, slow, and completely regular. The way breathing sounds when someone is calm and not trying to conceal it. The way breathing sounds when someone has a microphone open and is simply present on the other end of a connection. I lay there and listened to it for longer than I should have. Something about the regularity of it, the patience of it, made moving feel like an interruption I wasn't sure I had the right to make. Then I got up and went into the front room. No one was there. The window showed only darkness and the tree line. I checked the door, locked, the way I'd left it. I went to the radio and looked at the frequency setting. It was on a channel I didn't use and hadn't used during that assignment. A channel that wasn't part of our district's rotation, and I hadn't touched the radio before going to bed. I switched it back to the correct frequency, stood there for a moment, and went back to bed. I told myself interference. I told myself I'd bumped the frequency dial without noticing. I told myself there were a dozen mundane explanations for an old radio in a mountain station picking up unusual transmissions. These explanations were all technically possible, and none of them felt true, but I filed them in the useful fiction category and went back to sleep. I took a day off from overnights after that stretch and then went back for one more. Before I went to bed, I double-checked the radio frequency, noted it explicitly in my patrol log with a timestamp, and went to sleep. I woke up at what I later confirmed to within a few minutes of the same time as before. The radio was on. I went to the front room and checked the frequency without turning on the light. It was on the same off-rotation channel it had been on the previous time. Not where I'd left it and logged it. Changed. And this time, there was a voice. It was not static. It was not interference. Shaped vaguely like a voice. It was a voice, a human voice, a woman's voice, speaking clearly enough to be understood. It said a name. A woman's name, not mine, said once. Just the name, clearly. And then the line went to static and stayed there. I stood in that front room for a long time. Long enough for my eyes to adjust fully to the dark and for me to become certain that I was fully awake and that I had heard what I had heard. I drove out before first light. Later that season, I was working alongside a staff member who'd been on the district for 15 years, a quiet man who knew the terrain better than anyone I'd worked with. I brought it up sideways and mentioned that the radio in the backstation seemed to have some persistent interference issues. Asked if it had ever been looked at. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Yeah, that station has some quirks." I asked what kind. He said 2 seasonals in the years before my assignment had cut their overnights short without completing their stretches, both of them citing equipment issues, and that as far as he knew, nobody had followed up seriously because nobody had wanted to be the person who put something unfollowable in an official report. He didn't say anything else about it. We finished our lunch. After the season, I went through the district records, going back as far as I could access, looking for any documented incident tied to that station. I found a single entry in an administrative log from 1962. The entry described a search that had been conducted for a female seasonal employee who'd been assigned to the backstation for an extended patrol period and had not checked in at the expected time. The search had covered the surrounding area. The entry noted that the search was concluded after several days and that the disposition was listed as undetermined. The name in the administrative entry was the name I'd heard on the radio. Said the same way. First and last, clearly, the way you'd call someone you expected to respond. She was assigned to a post in the backcountry, and she went out and didn't come back. And 60 years later, something is still saying her name in the room she was last assigned to. I never went back to that station. I have no interest in going back. Story 6. My uncle has held on to the same 200 acres in Breathitt County through 30 years of economic pressure that has stripped a lot of families in that area of land their parents and grandparents worked their whole lives to keep. He got it from his father, who got part of it from his father, and he's hunted it every fall without exception and walked every corner of it in every season for decades. He knows the timber and the creek bottom and the ridgeline, the way you know a place when your body has moved through it regularly enough that your feet know where to step before your eyes confirm it. He's been running trail cameras for about 15 years. Nothing fancy. He uses standard motion-activated units that stamp the date and time on each image, mounts them on trees at locations he's identified as productive over years of observation, pulls the SD cards every 3 weeks or so, and reviews the images at his kitchen table after supper. It's become its own ritual. Supper, dishes, SD cards, an hour or two of going through images in order. He keeps a notebook where he logs what he sees. A few years back, he pulled the cards after a stretch that covered the last 3 weeks of October and sat down for his usual review. Most of it was routine. Deer in patterns he recognized from previous seasons. Coyotes working the creek corridor after dark. A lot of raccoons. He went through 4 of the 6 cameras without anything requiring much note. The 5th card was from a camera he'd mounted on a large beech tree overlooking a creek crossing in the deep back portion of the property, the part of the 200 acres that butts up against national forest land on the far boundary, and that takes about 40 minutes to reach on foot from the nearest point you can leave a vehicle. Remote. The only practical access from outside the property would be through the national forest timber, which is possible but requires knowing the terrain or being willing to navigate rough country with a map. He went through the early images from that card the same way he went through everything else, methodically, in order. Then he got to a sequence taken in the middle of the night, running from just before 2 a.m. to just after. There were 6 images in the sequence before the camera went dormant again. The first image, creek crossing, tree line, empty. Camera triggered by something but nothing visible in the frame. Second image, same. Empty creek crossing. Timestamp 20-some minutes after the first. Third image, still empty. But the timestamp was only about 90 seconds after the second image, which meant the camera had re-triggered almost immediately after the previous image's motion window closed. Fourth image, empty again, 30 seconds after the third, but there was a disturbance in the water, a spreading ring, the kind you see when something has just entered still water, or when something is moving below the surface and the movement is expressing itself at the top. Something had just moved at that spot in the creek when the camera triggered. Fifth image, a person standing in the creek at that exact spot. He described it to me at Thanksgiving, and I looked at that image on his phone for a long time. The figure was mid-thigh deep in water that would have been somewhere in the upper 30s at that point in late October, standing in the center of the creek, which at that crossing runs maybe 15 feet bank to bank, facing directly at the camera, which was mounted at chest height on the beech tree, maybe 40 feet from the near bank. No light source of any kind. Dressed in what looked like dark clothing. The posture was fully upright, arms at the sides, absolutely still. Not the posture of someone caught mid-movement by a camera trigger, but the posture of someone who had arrived at a position and was holding it. The detail I couldn't get past was the camera orientation. He mounts his cameras at chest height, angled slightly downward, and he marks the mounting spot with a small piece of reflective tape at the back of the camera housing, so he can find the unit again in heavy cover. In daylight, with knowledge of where to look, you could find the camera. In the dark, without knowing where to look, you couldn't. The camera housing was black against dark bark on a dark tree 40 feet from the water. There was no way to see it, and the figure in the water was facing it precisely, not generally in that direction, not facing the bank where the camera might be, but angled directly at the specific spot on the beech tree where the unit was mounted, like they knew exactly where it was. The sixth image was taken 2 minutes after the fifth. The creek crossing was empty. The figure was gone. He called the sheriff's department. A deputy came out, walked the creek crossing, agreed that the image was unusual, said they'd be aware of the property and would flag the back road for patrol when resources allowed. Nothing came of it in any formal sense. He moved the camera to a different location the next season and hasn't put one back at that creek crossing since. 2 minutes of standing in near freezing water in the dark, holding a specific position, looking at a camera hidden in a tree, and then simply not being there, not walking out of frame, gone. The camera covers a wide enough arc that a person moving in any direction would have appeared in the sixth image. He still hunts those 200 acres. He goes in every fall, the same as he always has. He doesn't go to the back section at night, and he hasn't put a camera at the creek crossing again, and he won't. But he goes. He said his grandfather hunted that land, and his father hunted that land, and he's going to hunt it too. And whatever is in that creek at 2 in the morning can have the creek at 2 in the morning. The daylight and the deer sign and the 40 years of knowing every corner of the property, those are his, and he's keeping them. Story 7. There is a hollow in Mingo County that doesn't appear on any map under any name I've been able to find, and I have looked. Not obsessively, but with the low-grade persistence of someone who has had a question sitting in the back of their mind for going on 15 years, and who checks every few months when something reminds them of it. The hollow is real. I've been to it, but it doesn't have a designation in anything I've been able to access. People in the area who know about it call it the Church Hollow because of what's back in the trees, and that's the only name it has as far as I can tell. What's back in the trees is a stone foundation from a structure that was built sometime in the early decades of the last century. It's substantial, dry-laid stonework, a style of construction that reflects real knowledge in real time and real labor, with some walls still standing nearly 3 feet high. Inside the foundation, the timber that would have been the structure has mostly collapsed and rotted down to the ground over the decades, but you can read the footprint of the building and what's left, and it was not small. Whatever congregation used this place, they built it to last. Just beyond the northeast corner of the foundation is a cemetery, roughly rectangular, maybe 30 burial markers within it. The markers vary a lot in quality and legibility. Some are barely identifiable as markers at all, just upright stones with no visible inscription, while others have text that's partially readable, if you get close and take your time. The readable ones give names and dates that cluster in the first decades of the century. Whatever denomination this was, it served a community that lived and died in this hollow through the early half of the 1900s, and then apparently dispersed or declined or moved on, leaving the foundation and the cemetery behind. I went in with 2 friends in September of 2011 when we were 19 years old. We'd heard about the place throughout our childhoods, in the way you hear about local landmarks in small communities. References in other conversations, a detail in a story someone was telling about something else, the name dropped and then moved past as if the person telling it assumed you already knew what the Church Hollow was. We hiked in from the nearest gravel road about a mile, no established trail. We found the foundation without much trouble because once you get close enough, the stonework is genuinely prominent. Those walls rising out of the forest floor are not easy to miss, even when the vegetation is heavy. We spent time at the foundation, then moved to the cemetery. We walked it slowly, pausing at each marker, getting close when the text looked potentially readable, trying to piece together something about who these people were from what the stone would still give up. Most of the markers gave up very little. Names weathered to initials or to nothing. Dates compressed into illegibility. by the freeze-thaw cycles of 100 winters. My friend Jamie had more patience for it than the rest of us, and she worked her way to the back of the cemetery while we were still in the middle section. She called us over. She'd found a marker near the back corner that was substantially more readable than most of the others. The stone type was different, harder, slower to weather, and the carving had held up better because of it. 3 lines of text, all of them legible if you crouched down and read carefully in the afternoon light. Line 1, a woman's name, common enough for the era. Line 2, a death year, 1923. Line 3, a date, not another year, a full date. Month written out, day, year. The year was 2008. We all read it. We read it more than once. The 3 of us crouching around this marker in the back corner of a cemetery in a hollow with no name. And none of us said anything for a while, because there wasn't anything immediately to say. Jamie took out her phone and photographed it. Several images from different angles, with and without her hand in the frame for scale. We looked at the stone itself. We looked at the 2 sections of text, the 1923 line and the 2008 date below it, and tried to find a visual difference between them. Depth of cut, weathering, lichen growth in the carved channels, which is one of the most reliable indicators of relative age in stone inscription. We couldn't find a difference. The lichen in the 3rd line, the 2008 date, appeared the same density and the same color as the lichen in the lines above it. If someone had added that date to the stone after 1923, they'd done it long enough ago that decades of weather and biological growth had made the addition indistinguishable from the original. We walked out of there faster than we'd walked in. About 3 months later, Jamie sent me a message saying she'd been doing some research and had found something. She'd found a reference to the hollow in a county historical document from the 1940s, a survey of rural communities in Mingo County. The entry for what it called the unnamed hollow off the creek road was only a paragraph, but at the end of it was a single sentence the survey author had apparently felt worth including without elaboration. Residents of adjacent hollows report long-standing reluctance to enter the site, which they attribute to local tradition rather than any specific incident. She also found separately in county courthouse records a deed transfer from 1908 for a parcel of land that matched the approximate location of the hollow. The transfer was from a private individual to the fellowship. The price listed was $1. The grantor's name on the deed was a woman's name, the same name as the marker we'd found in the cemetery. The woman who died in 1923. She gave the land to the fellowship in 1908. She was buried in the cemetery on that land in 1923. And below her death year, carved in stone in the same weathered style, was 2008. Jamie has that photograph. I've seen it within the last year, and it's exactly as I remember. 3 lines, the 3rd line, a full date. No visible difference in the stone between the sections. I've asked people from the area about the hollow over the years. The responses fall into 2 types, cleanly. The first type says they've never heard of it and seems to mean it. The second type goes quiet. Not uncomfortable, not frightened. A different kind of quiet. The kind that says, I know what you're talking about and I've thought about it, and I've decided that talking about it more isn't something I want to do with my afternoon. Those people change the subject and don't come back to it, and they do it in a way that's so practiced it's clearly not the first time someone has asked. Neither option resolves into anything comfortable. Story 8. I was 17 years old and I'd been babysitting regularly since I was 14. In a small community where reliable teenage babysitters are known quantities, you build up a client list through word of mouth, and by the time I was 16, I had 4 or 5 families who called me regularly enough that I had standing availability on their schedules. I was not a nervous sitter. I was experienced enough that I dealt with kids who wouldn't sleep, kids who got sick, a minor medical situation that required a calm head and a call to parents, a power outage, and various combinations of difficult pets and difficult weather. I knew what to do when things went sideways. The family I sat for most regularly had 2 kids, a 4-year-old boy named Caleb and a 6-year-old girl named Abby. Good kids. Abby was a drawer who could occupy herself for hours with paper and markers, and Caleb was a builder who turned whatever was available into elaborate constructions and then narrated their structural failures in great detail. The house was on a gravel road in Carter County, set back from the road with a good yard and a small barn structure behind it, and a tree line beyond the barn. No close neighbors. The house itself was solid, good windows with real locks, exterior doors with deadbolts. I'd sat there a dozen times at minimum without a moment of unease. The night in question was in November, a Friday. Both kids were tired from school, and I had them both down by 8:15. By the time I came back to the living room, the house had the particular quality of quiet that settles in when children are genuinely asleep. Not held quiet, not the quiet of kids pretending, but the real thing. I made myself comfortable on the couch with the television on low. The parents were due back around 11. Around 9:30, I heard Caleb's door open. A moment later, he appeared in the hallway doorway in his pajamas, not distressed, just awake. He came into the living room and stood near the couch and looked at me, and he said, "The man outside is keeping me awake." I asked him what he meant, if he'd had a dream. He said no. The man was there, he'd seen him. I asked where, and he said outside his window in the backyard. I went to his room with him. His window faces the backyard. A rectangular yard, maybe 40 feet deep, with the barn structure at the back and the tree line beyond it. I looked out. The yard was dark, and the way yards are dark, when there's no artificial light, not impenetrable. There was enough ambient from the sky that I could see the shapes of things, the barn, the fence line, the tree trunks at the edge of the timber. Nothing moving. No person visible anywhere. I told him he'd probably dreamed it, or seen a shadow that had looked like something in the way shadows do when you're half asleep. I got him a glass of water, stayed with him while he drank it, sat on the edge of his bed until he seemed calm, and went back to the living room. 25 minutes later, he was back in the hallway. He was standing in the doorway with his hands at his sides, and his expression was not frightened exactly. Caleb was not a dramatic child. He didn't perform emotions he didn't feel, but it was serious. He said the man was still there. He was standing and looking at the house. I turned off the lights in the main part of the house so the interior light wouldn't create reflections in the glass, and I went to every window on the back side of the house in sequence. Caleb's room, the bathroom between his room and Abby's, the kitchen. I looked carefully at each one. The barn, the fence, the tree line, all of it visible, all of it still. No person, nothing moving. I checked the back door, deadbolted. I checked the front door, deadbolted. I turned the lights back on. I sat with Caleb in his room for longer this time, probably 40 minutes, until I was certain he was deeply asleep. Then I went back to the living room and sat on the couch and tried to return to the book and the television, and found I couldn't really focus on either. The house was fine, every lock was engaged, but I was sitting with both feet on the floor instead of tucked under me the way I usually sat, and the book stayed closed in my lap. At 10:15, my phone rang. Unknown number, local area code. I answered because the possibility that it was the parents calling from a different phone was real enough that I didn't want to miss it. There was nothing on the line. Not static, not the ambient noise of an open connection. Nothing. The quality of silence you get when someone is there and not speaking, which is different from the quality of silence you get when a call is dropped. The first kind has presence in it. This had presence. It lasted somewhere between 10 and 15 seconds, and then the line went dead. I called the mother's cell immediately. She and her husband were back in 18 minutes, which was faster than the drive from where they'd been should have allowed. Her husband walked the full perimeter of the property with a large flashlight, including the barn interior and the area along the tree line. He came back in and said he hadn't found anything. He said it in the way men say things when they don't want to alarm the other adults in the room in front of the children, which is to say, he said it carefully and didn't quite meet my eyes when he said it. He found the boot prints the next morning. Along the base of the fence on the back property line, in a section of muddy ground where the yard meets the fence before the tree line, there were 2 sets of boot prints, adult male probably based on the size, positioned facing the house, both sets parallel to each other, maybe 15 feet apart. Like 2 people had stood there side by side for a period of time, looking across the yard toward the house, and then at some point had gone back into the trees. The ground was soft enough that if they'd been moving quickly or carelessly, the impressions would have been disrupted. They were clean prints, deliberate positions. I sat for that family 2 more times over the following months. Both times were quiet. But when I asked Caleb once, as gently as I could, of whether the man in the yard had come back, he looked at me and said no. And then he looked at the window, and then he looked back at me and said, "I don't think he went away, though." I've held that sentence for years, said by a 4-year-old looking at the window, in the tone children use when they're reporting something they're certain of. I don't think he went away, though. Story 9. I should start by telling you that the neighbor I'm going to describe, the woman I'll call Dot, is still alive and still lives in the house next door to me. And she is a private person who has not asked me to tell this story and would probably prefer that I didn't. I'm telling it anyway because I think it's the kind of thing that deserves to exist somewhere outside of the shoebox it's been sitting in. Dot's husband, who I'll call Weston, died about 4 years ago at 78. They'd been married for 55 years. She asked me to help her go through his belongings a few months after the service, when she felt ready, because her children were scattered across 3 states, and she didn't want to wait and didn't want to do it alone. Weston was a retired surveyor. He'd worked for a private firm based in Boone for over 30 years and done contract work with county land offices throughout the region. And he had a home office full of the accumulated material of that career. He was a precise man in the way surveyors tend to be precise, detail-oriented, systematic, not given to anything that couldn't be measured and recorded. Dot and I spent most of a Saturday afternoon going through the office. We worked methodically, equipment to his former colleagues, reference books to the library, records organized into what was worth keeping and what wasn't. In the back of his office closet, on the floor behind a row of boots, Dot found a shoebox that she said she'd never seen before. She said it without alarm. Just a factual observation that she'd been in that closet many times over 55 years, and she didn't recognize that box. Inside was a small notebook, with a black marbled cover and a single sealed envelope. The envelope had nothing written on it. No name, no address, no indication of who it was for or from. The notebook had entries in Weston's handwriting going back approximately 20 years. The first 2/3 of it was exactly what you'd expect from someone in his profession. Mileage logs, equipment notes, brief descriptions of survey jobs with parcel numbers and dates. His handwriting was consistent. He wrote the same way in his 70s that he'd written in his 50s. The last section of the notebook was different. The handwriting was the same, but it was more careful, smaller. The way someone writes when they're aware that what they're writing deserves more attention than their ordinary notes. He'd surveyed a parcel of land in a remote area of Watauga County. He gave enough bearings and reference points to locate it approximately, but no road name, no formal parcel identifier. The access was by an old logging road off a county route, and when he'd gone to research the ownership through the normal channels, he'd come up empty in ways he found unusual enough to note. He wrote that the deed history was incomplete in a way that wasn't consistent with normal record gaps. He'd gone out to the land. He described structures on it, more than one, built at different times. Evidence of active occupation. Personal items inside, recent enough to suggest current use rather than abandonment. He found a tire track in the mud of the logging road that was fresh, not weathered. He noted two distinct structures on his first visit, one that appeared to be a residence of some kind, and one that was smaller and set back further from the logging road access, of a type he said he couldn't immediately categorize. He noted that the second structure had no windows, and that the door, which was heavy relative to the size of the structure, was padlocked on the outside when he first saw it. On a later visit, the padlock was gone, but the door was closed. He did not say whether he opened it. On the entry for that visit, the writing changes. It gets smaller and more compressed for about half a page, and then stops mid-sentence. And the next entry is from several months later and makes no reference to what the earlier entry had been about. That half page of compressed writing is mostly illegible. But near the end of that section, clearly legible compared to the surrounding text, is the phrase "should not be openable from outside." He went back, multiple times over a period of about 3 years. He reported the situation to the county land office and was told the parcel had been reviewed and no action was needed. He tried a different approach through the county planning office. Same result. He tried a contact he had at the state level. Same thing. Reviewed, no action needed. He wrote that the consistency of the response from multiple offices was itself notable. The entries after that got shorter and grew briefer, and then on the last written page, a single line, dated about 6 weeks before the stroke that killed him. I should not have gone back. That was all. Below it, the rest of the page was blank. Dot held the sealed envelope for several minutes after I read that to her. She turned it over a few times and then set it in the shoebox on top of the notebook and said she was going to send the box to her son in Atlanta. About 6 months later, she called me on a Saturday morning and said she'd opened the envelope herself. The envelope had contained 2 things: a handwritten letter, 3 pages, in Weston's careful block lettering, and a photograph. She read me the parts of the letter that addressed the parcel. He had gone back one final time. He'd gone to the secondary structure and he'd opened the door. He didn't describe what was inside. The letter specifically said he wasn't going to describe it, that some information is not useful to the people who receive it, that he'd made his assessment and left, and that the assessment was that the parcel needed to be left alone by everyone, including him, permanently. The photograph was of the logging road entrance to the parcel, taken from the county road looking in, just trees and the 2-track disappearing into the timber. Nothing visible in the photograph that would tell you anything about what was at the end of the road. On the back of the photograph, in Weston's handwriting, one word: don't. Dot said she'd burned the letter and the photograph in the wood stove that morning, which was why she was calling now. She'd wanted to tell someone what they'd contained before she stopped being the person who knew. She said she thought the right number of people who knew the contents of that letter was 1, and she'd been that person for about 4 hours, and now she was going to stop being that person. I told her she'd done the right thing. I believe that. A careful and methodical man who spent his professional life in those mountains wrote 6 words in a notebook and 1 word on a photograph, and together they were enough to tell everyone everything they needed to know. I should not have gone back. Don't. That's the whole of what needs to be said. Story 10. My dog's name is Biscuit. I want to tell you her name because I think it's important that she be a specific animal rather than a generic narrative device, and because everything that follows depends on you understanding what kind of dog she is and what her baseline behavior looks like, because the deviation from that baseline is the entire point. Biscuit is a beagle mix, beagle and something larger, we think, because she's a little bigger than a purebred beagle, but the beagle personality is dominant. I've had her since she was 12 weeks old, which makes her 8 years old now, and I've spent 8 years watching her interact with the world. She is an extrovert in the truest sense of the word. She has never in 8 years met a person she didn't want to win over. She does the thing beagles do, where she approaches everyone, adults, children, strangers, People who clearly don't want to be approached, with her whole body involved in the greeting, tail, and hips and ears, all going at once, pressing into people's legs, looking up at them with that specific beagle expression that says, "You are my favorite, and also my previous favorite was also my favorite, but you, specifically." She's like this with every person she encounters without exception. She has also never in 8 years displayed anything I would describe as sustained fear directed at a person. She's startled at loud noises. She's wary of certain other dogs. She has opinions about bicycles that have never been fully resolved. But toward people, she is consistently, reliably, irreversibly friendly. I live on 5 acres in Rabun County with my husband, Tom. We're bordered by forest on 3 sides and have a long private driveway off the county road. The fenced yard is maybe half an acre, and Biscuit has had run of it since she was big enough to navigate the dog door. She walks the full property with us regularly and has done so for 6 years. She knows the fence line the way she knows her own bed. Last October, Tom had a work week out of town, a 5-day stretch. First night alone with Biscuit, fine, completely normal. The second night I was asleep by 11 and Biscuit had gone to her bed, same as always. I woke up at some point in the middle of the night without knowing why. I lay still for a moment, the way you do, trying to determine what had woken me. Then I realized Biscuit wasn't on her bed. She was at the bedroom door, standing rigid. Every hair on her back was raised, which I'd never seen before in 8 years. She was making a sound I had also never heard before. Not barking, not growling, not whimpering. A continuous low sound with her teeth showing, almost mechanical in its steadiness. Like something had shorted inside her and was running on a circuit that didn't include any of her normal emotional processing. Her eyes were on the bedroom window, locked on it, not moving. I got up and looked out the window. The bedroom window faces the east side of the yard. The fence, the tree line beyond the fence, the dark of the field that runs along that side of the property. There was nothing visible. I checked the camera app on my phone, which has live feeds from exterior cameras on all 4 sides of the house. All 4 feeds looked normal. No motion alerts had come through. I tried to calm Biscuit, spoke to her, touched her, the standard reassurance routine. She acknowledged me with a flicker of her eyes and then went straight back to the window. The hackles didn't come down. The sound didn't stop. I'd never seen her unable to be reached by a familiar voice and touch, and not being able to reach her was its own kind of alarming. After about 10 minutes, I let her up on the mattress with me, which she almost never does. I lay there with my back against the headboard and Biscuit pressed against my side, rigid, her eyes on the window, and we stayed like that. She held that posture for close to 2 hours. At around 1:50 in the morning, she let out a long, slow breath, almost a sigh, almost deliberate, and her muscles relaxed all at once, and she went to sleep like flipping a switch. I lay there for another 40 minutes before I felt settled enough to sleep. In the morning, I walked the yard before anything else. I checked the fence line on the east side of the property, the side the window faces, and found it. A section of grass along the inside base of the fence, maybe 6 feet long, pressed flat against the ground. Not dead, not damaged, just pressed flat. The way grass gets pressed when something leans against the fence above it for an extended period. The fence at that point is a 4-foot privacy fence, solid boards. From the outside, standing at the fence, you'd have a sight line to the bedroom window. You'd be able to see in clearly if the lights were on inside, and it was dark outside, which is exactly the configuration that existed at midnight. He came home Friday evening. Saturday morning, we were on the porch with coffee, and he walked out into the yard and stopped near the east fence and turned and asked me when I'd put the burlap bags on the fence. 2 burlap feed bags, the kind used for livestock grain, 50-pound bag size, were hanging from the fence posts at either end of that 6-foot section of pressed grass. tied onto the posts with rope, not just draped. Someone had made loops in the rope and attached the bags to the posts deliberately at roughly shoulder height. They had not been there when I'd walked the fence line on Wednesday morning. I'd been in the yard Thursday and Friday and hadn't been near that section of fence, and I hadn't put them there. Tom hadn't been home. Nobody else had been on the property. We cut them down. We didn't open them. Tom bagged them in a contractor bag without examining them and put them in the outside trash. We replaced that section of fencing with something 8 feet tall and put a motion-activated floodlight at each end of it. Tom told me something later that I hadn't known. He said on Saturday morning he'd gone out to the porch early around 5:30 with his coffee, and Biscuit had come with him. He said she went to the edge of the porch and stopped. She didn't go down the steps into the yard, which she always does. She stood at the edge of the porch with her nose working, and she looked at the east fence, and she made the same mechanical low sound with the teeth showing. Coming from a dog who was standing in full daylight on her own porch looking at a section of fence she'd looked at 1,000 times before. She detected it from the porch. She didn't cross the yard toward it. She registered it and made the sound and then came inside, which I read as, "I know it's there and I am not going near it, and neither should you." Whatever was at that fence, she knew. She knew better than to go toward it. She told us what she knew with the tools she had, and eventually Tom listened. 8 years of unconditional enthusiasm for every person and thing in her world. And she drew a line at that fence, and she held it. Biscuit has been completely normal since that week. Whatever was at that fence on Wednesday night hasn't come back, or if it has, it's staying far enough away that she isn't registering it. I don't know what was at the fence. I know she did. That's all 16 for this one. Thank you to everyone who took the time to write these down and send them in. That's not a small thing, putting something like this on paper, and I don't take it lightly that people trust this channel with it. A lot of these came with a note saying some version of, "I've never told anyone this before," which is something I think about every time a new submission comes in. There are a lot of people out there carrying things they've never found a way to say out loud. And if this is a place where some of that gets said, then that matters to me. The submission email is in the description. If you have something you've been sitting on, send it. If it's too long, send it anyway. If it happened years ago and you're not sure it's still worth telling, it is. Subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you in the next one. Story 11. My cousin Danny and I grew up spending the majority of our summers at our grandparents' farm in Sevier County. And when I say majority, I mean most of June, most of July, and the first part of August every year from the time I was about 6 until I was 14 or 15. That farm was one of the fixed points of my childhood. I could draw the layout of it from memory right now. The house and the garden and the chicken yard and the barn and the back pasture and the ridge that rose behind the property and the long stretch of timber that covered the ridge and ran down the far side into national parkland. Danny was 2 years younger than me, and we got along well. We had the same instincts about how to spend a day in the woods and the creek, ranging as far as we were allowed to range on the property, and occasionally a little beyond that. We were not reckless kids. We understood the woods the way you understand something you've spent hundreds of hours inside of. The summer this happened, I was 12 and Danny was 10. It was mid-July, a hot and hazy afternoon. We'd been in the creek earlier in the day, and after lunch we went back to the timber on the property's upper boundary because it was cooler up there in the shade. We were probably half a mile from the house, and maybe a little more, in good familiar terrain. We'd been up on the ridge for maybe an hour when we both heard it at the same moment. I know it was simultaneous because we both stopped moving at the same instant, without any signal from each other, which is something that happens when two people react to the same external stimulus at the same time. We were standing maybe 10 feet apart, and we both stopped and turned in the same direction. A woman's voice coming from the trees to our left, slightly downhill from where we were on the ridge, calling Danny's name. Not my name, specifically only his name. The tone was pitch perfect for what it was imitating. an adult woman calling a child in from outside. The specific carrying pitch of that call, the two-syllable rise and fall on his name. The kind of call that reaches, the kind you've heard 1,000 times from a back porch or a yard. We looked at each other for a second, and then both started moving in the direction of the sound because the assumption was automatic. One of our grandmothers was out looking for us, which happened occasionally when we'd lost track of time. We just started moving toward the voice. We walked maybe 60 or 70 feet toward where the sound had come from, pushing through a section of thick laurel, coming out the other side onto a small flat area. And then we heard it again, still to our left, still downhill, still the same distance away as it had been when we were standing on the ridge. We'd moved 60 feet toward it, and it hadn't gotten any closer. Danny stopped, and I stopped. We stood there in the flat area and listened. There were the regular sounds of the woods in mid-July. And then the voice again, his name, the same pitch, the same carry. Still exactly where it had been before. Still exactly the same distance. I want to try to describe what that felt like, because I think it's the most important part of the story. It wasn't immediately frightening, it was disorienting in a way that preceded fear. The kind of disorientation you get when something violates a basic physical principle that your body depends on without knowing it. Sound doesn't work like that. You move toward a sound, the sound gets closer. That's not an assumption, that's physics. When physics doesn't cooperate, your brain stutters before it does anything else. And in that stutter, there's a window before any emotional response arrives. We stood in that window for a moment. Then Danny said quietly that it didn't sound like either of them. He was right. I'd processed it the same way before he said it. The pitch was right, the tone was right. The specific carrying quality of the call was right, but the voice itself was not a voice we knew. It had the correct surface properties of a familiar call without being the voice of anyone familiar. Like something had learned what the call was supposed to sound like and was reproducing the form without the content. We changed direction, angled further left, downhill, toward the sound. We pushed through another stretch of brush. The voice came again before we cleared the brush. Still to our left, still the same distance. We stopped. We stood there in the timber in the heavy July heat, and we didn't talk for a minute. And then Danny said, "Let's go back." Not in a frightened voice. In the voice he used when he'd figured something out, and had moved past the figuring out stage to the decision stage. He was 10 years old, and he'd gotten there before I had, which is still something I think about. We turned around and went back toward the farm at a pace that was faster than our normal woods pace without being a run. We didn't run because somewhere in both of us there was a sense that running was the wrong response, that whatever was making that sound was attuned to certain behaviors, and running might be one of them. We walked fast. We stayed on the paths we knew. We came out of the timber into the back pasture and crossed it and went into the house. Both grandmothers were inside. One of them hadn't left the house since after breakfast. The other had been working in the side yard garden for the past couple of hours and confirmed when we asked her that she hadn't been in the timber or up on the ridge. At supper, we told what had happened. I watched my grandfather's face through the telling. When we finished, he was quiet for a moment and then said we'd done exactly right coming back to the house and not following the sound further in. He said it like a commendation, flat and factual. We waited for more. He went back to his supper. That was all he said, then and later. Years later, Danny told me he'd heard it again, not in the same place, different terrain, different state. He'd been working seasonally in a remote area of the Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina, and one evening walking back to camp from a work site, alone, a few hundred feet from where the trail entered the camp clearing, he'd heard his name. Once, clearly, from the trees to his right. The same voice. He was certain of that. He said he didn't stop walking. He kept moving at the same pace and he went directly into the camp. He said he'd processed it the same way he'd processed the thing on the ridge when we were kids. Not with fear exactly, but with a kind of cold clarity. The specific alertness that comes from recognizing something you've encountered before and remembering that the right response is to keep moving and not to look. I asked him what he thought it was. He said he thought it was something that ranged widely, that wasn't tied to a specific place. He said he thought it had probably been following the same calling behavior in a lot of places over a long time. He said the thing to know about it, the single most useful thing, was that it had never managed to make him stop walking toward the house. Both times it had called him, it had done so in a direction that would have taken him away from where he was going, away from safety and toward isolation. And both times he'd recognized that and kept moving. He said he teaches his kids, he has two now, a boy and a girl, who spend time in the woods with him, to know where they're going before they go in and to keep going there if they hear something that doesn't fit. Not to run, not to stop, not to turn toward the sound. Just to keep moving toward the place they were already moving toward. Almost right is more dangerous than clearly wrong every time. Story 12. My wife and I have lived in the same house in Dickinson County for 11 years. And in 11 years, I've come to know the rhythms of the road out front, the way you know the rhythms of any road you spend your days adjacent to. It's a state highway, 2 lanes, winding through the kind of terrain that keeps it from ever being fast. There's not a lot of traffic on it by any objective measure, but there's enough that I can read patterns. Which vehicles belong to the area, which hours see the most activity, what a normal profile of a day looks like in terms of what passes. When something's off pattern, I tend to notice. We have a gravel pull-off beside the property, a natural wide spot that we graded flat and graveled maybe 8 years ago after one too many people, attempting to turn around in our driveway and leaving ruts. It gets used. People miss their turn somewhere down the road and come back. People stop to look at their phones. Occasionally, someone pulls off because they need a minute, and our pull-off is convenient. I've never minded this. It's that kind of road and that kind of community. In February, 4 years ago, a Tuesday or Wednesday night, I woke up somewhere around 4:30 in the morning because our exterior motion lights had come on. They stayed lit for 90 seconds if nothing's keeping them triggered, and then they cut off until the next motion event. They didn't cut off. They stayed on. After about 10 minutes of lying there watching the curtains stay lit, my wife nudged me and I got up and looked out the front window. There was a car in the pull-off, dark-colored, an older model sedan. The engine was running. I could see the exhaust rising pale against the dark trees behind the pull-off, thick the way exhaust gets in cold air, which told me the engine had been running for a while. The car had been there long enough to trigger the motion lights repeatedly and keep them on, and the engine had been running long enough to be well warmed up. I checked the clock. 4:42 in the morning. I sat in the chair by the window and watched the pull-off. The car didn't move. No one got out. No one knocked on the door or approached the house. It just sat there with the engine running and the exhaust rising in the cold air. At 6 o'clock, I dressed and went out. The temperature was in the low 20s. I walked across the yard and up to the driver's side of the car and looked through the window. There was a man in the driver's seat. His head was resting against the window, eyes closed. He appeared to be asleep, deeply asleep. He was older than me, probably mid to late 60s. He was dressed in a way that struck me even in that first look as unexpectedly neat for a man asleep in a car at 6 in the morning on a county road in February. Collared shirt, buttoned properly. What looked like a sport coat or blazer. He had a clean, close shave. He didn't look like someone who'd been sleeping rough or who was in distress. He looked like someone who had deliberately gone to sleep in their car while dressed for something else. I knocked on the window with my knuckle twice. He came awake fast, the snap to of someone who isn't a heavy sleeper. He looked at me through the glass for a moment. and then rolled the window down. A wave of warm air came out into the cold. He apologized immediately, said he'd pulled over because he was too tired to drive, and hadn't meant to stay as long as he had. His voice was clear and his words were organized, not groggy, not slurred. He sounded like a man telling a prepared explanation rather than one reaching for language through sleep. I told him the pull-off was fine, that he was welcome to use it, and asked if he was all right or needed anything. He said he was fine, just needed the rest. And then he looked past me at the house. Not a quick glance, a deliberate look, taking it in, and he said, "I didn't figure anyone was home." I want to describe the physical situation at that moment to give that sentence its proper weight. Our porch light was on. The living room light was on because my wife had turned it on when I got up, visible through the front windows. The bedroom light was on because I'd turned it on to dress. My truck was parked in the driveway, 15 feet to his left. My wife's car was in the driveway behind mine. There was no reasonable interpretation of that property at 6 in the morning from the driver's seat of the pull-off that led to the conclusion that no one was home. The lights, the vehicles, and then me standing at his window in my coat. All of it at every stage indicated occupation. He said he didn't figure anyone was home. Past tense. Which meant it was an assessment he'd made at some earlier point and filed as a conclusion he was now reporting, not a mistake he was correcting in real time. He'd sat in that pull-off for at least 90 minutes, based on when I'd first seen the car, probably longer given the engine heat, with a view of the lit house and the vehicles in the driveway, and at some point during that time, he had arrived at the conclusion, or the wish, or the working assumption, that no one was inside. He pulled out a few minutes after we finished talking, went north on the highway. I went back inside and wrote down the plate number and the vehicle description in the notepad I keep on the kitchen counter, along with the time and what he'd said. I'm a notes-first kind of person, and I've found over the years that the impulse to write something down is usually the right one. I called the sheriff's department at 9 that morning. The deputy who took the call ran the plate and told me the vehicle was registered to an address about 4 hours south of us. He said he'd note the contact and make the department aware. My wife and I have talked about that sentence more times than I can count in the years since. I didn't figure anyone was home. We've turned it over from every angle trying to find the reading of it that's benign, that makes him a confused or tired man who misspoke. We've tried. The sentence doesn't cooperate. It was said in a conversational tone, unprompted, offered as a fact rather than an error. He said it the way you'd say it if you were explaining why you'd parked where you'd parked, because you looked at the situation and made an assessment about who was inside, and the assessment you made was that no one was. What do you do with that information if no one's home at 6 in the morning in a rural house in February, and you've been sitting in the pull-off long enough for the engine to heat up thoroughly in 20-degree weather? I don't know the answer to that question. I know he said it, and I know what the available evidence was when he said it, and I know that a man who sits in a pull-off for 90 minutes or more at 4 in the morning on a cold February night and then tells you he didn't figure anyone was home is not a man. I want to understand any better than I already do. Story 13. My grandfather's name was Earl, and he worked coal for 31 years, from the time he was 19 until the operation he worked for went through a reduction that included his position. He was a mechanical engineer in the mines, not a cutter, not a section foreman, but the man responsible for the mechanical systems that kept the underground operation running. Pumps, ventilation, conveyor systems, the electrical infrastructure that made everything else possible. He had a practical and precise mind, and he'd spent 31 years developing an intimate knowledge of how coal mines worked in every dimension: the geological, the mechanical, the acoustic. That last one matters for this story. The acoustics of an underground coal mine are specific and complex in ways that people who haven't worked underground tend not to think about. Sound behaves differently when it's contained by rock on all sides and has to travel through confined shafts and entries of varying dimensions. A conversation in one section can be audible as a murmur in another section 100 yards away. Water moving through cracks in the rock can sound from a distance, like something you can't immediately identify. My grandfather had spent 3 decades cataloging all of it, not formally, just in the working knowledge that any experienced underground person develops about the sounds their environment makes and what those sounds mean and what they don't mean. He told me this story in his kitchen on a winter evening about 5 years before he died, when I was in my early 20s and visiting for a weekend. He brought it up without lead-up. He said there was something he'd been thinking about telling me for a while, and he decided to do it now. And then he told it. In the mid-70s, he was working a mine in Tazewell County, and on a Saturday evening, he was doing a routine inspection of a section that had been shut down for the weekend. The section was idle. All the cutting equipment powered down, the conveyor stopped, the section crew gone. He was alone in the section, which was standard practice for this kind of walkthrough. He was about a quarter mile into the section, past the main junction, moving at the steady and unhurried pace of someone doing familiar work in familiar surroundings. His cap lamp was on, as it always was. He was comfortable with the environment in the way of someone who has been in similar environments thousands of times. He said he heard it when he was approximately at the midpoint between the junction and the face. He was careful about the word he used. He said singing, and then he immediately qualified it, because he was a precise man and he knew the word wasn't quite right. He said it had the quality of singing. It had the continuous tonal quality, the rise and fall, the sense of something intentional rather than random. But it was not a song he recognized, and it was not entirely in the register of a human voice. He said the register was lower than he expected, lower than normal human speech goes, lower than he'd heard any voice go, and there was a quality in the lower frequencies of it that he described as having too much room, meaning that whatever was producing the sound seemed to have a resonating chamber larger than a human chest. The sound traveled up the entry from the direction of the face, and it echoed, and between the direct sound and the echo, the entry was full of it. He stopped walking and he directed his cap lamp toward the section face at the far end of the entry. He called out. He didn't identify himself. He just produced a human voice in the direction of the sound. Hello, or hey, or something equally simple. The sound stopped. Immediately. Not fading, not resolving, not concluding the way a sound naturally ends. It stopped like a switch had been thrown exactly at the moment his voice entered the entry. And then the entry was quiet with the specific quality of quiet that exists in a coal mine when there's nothing running and there's no one there. A deep, pressurized, contained quiet that has almost a physical weight to it. He stood still for a moment. Then he moved forward to approximately where the sound had seemed to originate. He found nothing. The entry was empty from the junction to the face. No person, no equipment in an operational state, no source for the sound he could identify. He completed his inspection, he made his notes, he walked out of the section and drove home, and didn't say anything to anyone that evening or for a long time afterward. He said he'd rolled it through the catalog of sounds he'd built over 30 years of underground work, and that he'd been thorough about it, because he wanted an explanation, and he was the kind of man who found explanations if they were there to be found. There was nothing in the catalog. He knew that 31 years of underground experience had not produced a sound like that from any mind-generated source, and that the particular qualities of what he'd heard, the register, the tonal intentionality of it, the fact that it stopped the instant he produced a human voice, were not consistent with any category of mine acoustics he'd encountered or heard other miners describe. He said he'd thought about the timing of the stopping more than he'd thought about the sound itself. He'd been in that entry for several minutes before the sound started. In a quiet section with no mechanical noise, his footsteps on the entry floor would have been audible from a significant distance. Whatever was producing the sound had been aware of his presence from the moment he entered the section, had allowed him to walk a quarter mile toward it, and had been mid-production when he called out. It stopped not in response to the sound of his footsteps. It had had those for several minutes, but in response to his voice specifically. His voice directed toward it was different from his footsteps. It was recognition. He had acknowledged its presence, and it had responded to that acknowledgement by going silent. He said he'd never told anyone while he was working the mine, because there was no way to tell it that didn't end with him being the man who heard things in empty sections, which was not a reputation he wanted or needed. He told me in his kitchen 20-something years after it happened, because he'd decided it was worth leaving on record somewhere outside his own memory. He said one more thing. He said that when he'd walked out of that section at the end of the inspection that Saturday evening, he'd stopped at the section junction, the point where the shutdown section connected to the main haulage way, and he'd stood there for a moment and he'd said out loud to the empty tunnel behind him that whatever it was could have the section for the weekend, and that he'd be back Monday with the rest of the crew. He said the tunnel was completely silent after he said it, the kind of silence that has a quality of response. He walked out and drove home and went to work Monday, and went back into that section with the crew and spent many more years in that mine and never heard the sound again. He said the section was always quieter than the others after that. Not wrong quiet, just quiet, settled, like an account that had been brought to zero. I knew my grandfather well enough. He described what he heard and what he did and how the timing worked, and he left the interpretation to me, which was his way with most things. I've sat with it for a long time, and I'm leaving the interpretation to you. Story 14. I've spent a lot of time in the past 2 years deciding whether to tell this story, and the reason for the hesitation is not that I doubt what happened. I don't doubt it. I was fully awake and coherent, and I know exactly what I experienced. But I know precisely how it reads, and I know the first response most people will have to it. So, I want to be straightforward with you at the start. I am a methodical and practical person. I work in a field that requires careful observation and accurate reporting. I've been hiking backcountry terrain for over 15 years, and I have a high degree of familiarity with the kinds of experiences and perceptions the backcountry can produce. Altitude, dehydration, fatigue, the way isolation and sleep deficit affect your mind. I've accounted for all of those. I know what they feel like, and this was not any of them. The trip was a 3-day solo in a remote area of the Ocoee district in Polk County, Tennessee. I've done many solo trips in that terrain and in other comparable terrain. I know the area well. I had a full pack appropriate for the conditions and the duration. I'd filed in my trip plan with the proper contacts. I had a satellite communicator in addition to my phone. Everything by the book. There was nothing unusual about the first day and a half. On the morning of the second day, I was moving down a long ridge toward a creek crossing. The trail in that section is lightly used, overgrown in places, requiring some route finding in the sections where the tread has disappeared into the vegetation. You can do a full day on that trail without seeing another person. I'd done it before. I was about halfway down the ridge when I saw someone coming up, a woman older than me. I'd put her in her late 60s, possibly early 70s, though she moved with the ease of someone who'd been doing this long enough that age hadn't compromised it. She was carrying a day pack, using trekking poles efficiently, wearing appropriate footwear for the terrain. Everything about her external presentation said, experienced hiker. We said hello when we met on the trail. Both of us stopped, which is the trail custom. She asked how the creek crossing was ahead, and I told her water level was low, knee depth at most, good stepping stones on the right approach, easy crossing. She thanked me. I told her the trail tread disappeared in a section about 300 feet below where we were standing and to bear left when it did. We talked for maybe 3 minutes. Normal trail conversation. And then she said my name. First name and last name. Used together, embedded in a sentence about making camp before the second ridge, if the weather to the west moved the way it looked like it was going to move. She said it the way you say someone's name when you know them and you're talking to them. Not with any special emphasis, not as if she was displaying knowledge, just as part of the sentence. The way you use a name when it would be strange not to. I stopped. I looked at her. I said something like, "I'm sorry, have we met?" Because the disorientation of hearing your full name from a stranger's mouth in the middle of a remote trail on the second day of a solo trip is something that takes a moment to process. She smiled, nodding kindly, and said no, she didn't think we'd met. She said she just thought I should know about the weather, and she stepped around me and continued up the ridge. I turned around and watched her go. She moved well. She went around the curve in the trail above me and was out of sight. I stood there on that trail for a long time. I have never hiked with my name on my gear. I don't wear a name tag. My pack is not labeled. The only record of my name in connection with that trip was the trip plan I'd filed, which was with a contact person and not posted anywhere accessible. I'd spoken to the ranger at the trailhead station when I signed in 2 days before, but that interaction had used my name once, briefly. And this woman was not the ranger and had no visible connection to the station. There was no mechanism by which she could have known my name. I've gone over the mechanics of it for 2 years, and I can't find one. The weather did change that evening, and I was set up in camp. By late afternoon, the front moved through hard. Fast-moving, significant wind, rain that would have been miserable exposure on the ridge. I'd stopped where I stopped because of the clouds to the west that I'd been watching for a couple of hours. And because making camp before the ridge felt like the right call. I don't know whether I'd have pushed on without her warning. I've hiked that trail 3 more times since that trip, and I've made contact with everyone I know who hikes that area. I've described her as specifically as I can. Late 60s to early 70s, fit, brown hair going gray, experienced mover on trail. Trekking poles, smaller frame day pack. Nobody has matched that description to anyone they know who hikes that trail regularly. When she said my name, she said it without any particular inflection. Not with the weight of significance. Not with the quality that you'd expect if someone was demonstrating knowledge they shouldn't have. She said it the way you say someone's name when you've known them for a while, and it just belongs in the sentence. Unremarkably. Like knowing it required no more explanation than knowing anything else she knew. Whatever she was or wherever she came from, the information was good. The camp I made before the second ridge was the right camp for that night. I've made peace with not having an explanation. What I have instead is this. She knew my name. She told me something accurate and useful, and then she went up a trail that nobody I can find has ever seen her on. I haven't found her. I've stopped expecting to. Story 15. My family has held land in Swain County for as long as anyone in my family has kept records, which goes back several generations. The land changed shape over time the way rural family land does. Bits sold off during hard years, bits added when circumstances allowed, but the core of it stayed in the family and eventually came to my father, who held it until he died 4 years ago, and who left the back portion of it to me specifically. About 60 acres of mixed hardwood and creek bottom, dense terrain, a lot of elevation change, a creek that runs strong in wet season and shallow in dry. My father hadn't been back to that section in his last few years because of his health, and I hadn't been out there in a while either. After his estate settled, I made a trip to walk the back 40, which is what we always called it, even though it's more than that. Just an old shorthand that stuck. It was a Sunday morning in October, cool and clear, the leaves mostly turned. I went in from the access road that runs along the east boundary, which is gated at the county road, in which I unlocked and then locked behind me. About 40 minutes into the back section, I was in the creek bottom, where the timber gets heaviest, and I came to a clearing and found the campsite. I want to describe what I found precisely because the details matter. Firing. Stones arranged in a circle roughly 2 feet in diameter with a central ash pile. The ash was gray-white in the middle, which means it had dried after at least one soaking, and slightly darker at the edges where it had been rained on less thoroughly. I put the last fire at 2 to 3 weeks prior. A tarp, olive drab, 8 by 10 feet, strung between two trees with paracord at about 7 feet off the ground, with the front edge staked down to create a lean-to configuration. Still taut. The paracord was good quality and tied with competent knots. This was not a quickly assembled emergency shelter. It was a deliberate setup made by someone who knew what they were doing. A sleeping area. A flat section of ground roughly 6 by 3 feet, cleared of debris down to bare mineral soil. The surface compacted in a way that suggested repeated use. There was a depression in the soil that corresponded to the shape of a person sleeping in a consistent position over multiple nights. Personal items around the fire ring. Food wrappers from packaged goods. Empty tin cans, their lids cut and folded back, washed or rain-rinsed clean. A toothbrush, well worn. A partial bar of soap in a sealed Ziploc bag. A length of paracord coiled and hung on a branch. And separately from all of it, standing upright against one of the tarp anchor trees, one boot, right foot size 10 or 11, a mid-weight hiking boot with significant wear on the heel and the outside edge of the sole. Good quality originally, laced and tied. Just the one. I walked the perimeter of the clearing and found where the undergrowth had been beaten down in a rough trail leading away from the campsite further into the timber, heading toward the back boundary where the property meets national forest land. The beaten down trail was clearly the result of repeated passage over the same route. Not an old deer trail, a walking trail, human footfall on the same line enough times to suppress the vegetation and leave a readable path. I came back out and called the sheriff's department. They sent a deputy who agreed the campsite was recent and that the setup suggested sustained occupation rather than a night or two. She and her partner went in and spent about an hour and a half back there and came out without having found a person or any additional camps. I went back 6 weeks later with my brother. We went in expecting to find the campsite and instead found it gone. Cleared, not abandoned. The tarp removed, the food items and the boot and the personal items all gone. Even the paracord coil from the branch. The fire ring was still there. You can't move a fire ring. And the sleeping depression was still there, and the vegetation around the site still showed the footprint of occupation. But everything that had been above ground and movable had been taken. The beaten path into the timber was still there. My brother and I followed it further than I'd gone the first time, about 400 feet back before it curved uphill and the terrain changed significantly. And in a small flat area another 100 feet past the curve, there was a second fire ring, built in the same style as the first, ash in it. Rained on once, maybe twice. I'd put it at 10 days to 2 weeks old. My brother and I looked at each other and came back out. My brother went back a third time without telling me. He found a third fire ring, further back than the second, in a section of the creek bottom that neither of us had been to before. Around this fire ring there were more items. A bundle of clothing rolled tightly and tied with cord, a small cook kit, a plastic container with a lid, sealed. He photographed everything and left without touching anything. And beside the fire ring, propped against a tree, was a piece of cardboard with writing on it. He sent me the photograph. The writing was in marker, clear and deliberate. It said, "I know this is private land. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need somewhere to be for a while. I'll move on when I can." That's all it said. No name, no date. My brother said it had changed something for him about the situation, that the message made the person real in a way the campsites hadn't, made them specific, gave them a voice. He said he'd stood there, in the creek bottom, in the winter cold, reading that cardboard and feeling something complicated. Not fear, not anger. Something more like grief, or recognition, or the awareness that the story was more human than either of us had been letting it be. I padlocked the access road gate with a heavier lock and have kept it locked. The back boundary with the National Forest is almost impossible to fence given the terrain, and I know that anyone who wants to come in through the timber from that side can do so without using the access road. Whoever was camped in the creek bottom had been there long enough to build 3 camps, to wear a trail into the undergrowth, and to accumulate the kind of domestic items that suggest weeks rather than days. They were there before I walked it. They were very likely there while my father was ill and the property was going unwalked. I just need somewhere to be for a while. Written by hand on a piece of cardboard, propped against a tree in the timber, addressed to no one and to whoever found it. I don't have an ending for this one. I'm not sure there is one. Story 16. I'll be honest with you, I almost didn't send this in. I'm 73 years old and I've been in Clay County my entire life, and I'm not someone who goes looking for attention or for any kind of platform. My neighbor's granddaughter showed me one of your videos when she was visiting a few weeks back, and she passed along the email address for submissions, and I sat on it for a few weeks, trying to decide whether it was worth the effort. I've decided it is, not for my sake, but because I think the particular thing I'm going to describe is the kind of thing that other people in isolated rural areas should know about. I will not use my real name, and I won't give more geographic detail than the county, both because I'm a private person and because some of what I'm about to describe involves other people in my community who I haven't consulted about whether they want their situations discussed publicly. I've lived in the same house on the same road in Clay County for 40 years. I raised 3 children in it. My husband Roger and I lived in it together for 28 years before he died of a heart attack in 2012, and I've lived in it alone since then. I know this house and this road and this community as well as I know anything. I know who lives in each of the 11 houses on this road, and I know their vehicles, and I know their routines well enough to know when something is different. When you've lived the same life in the same place for long enough, the differences from the expected pattern register automatically, the way a misspelling in a familiar text jumps out. A little over 4 years ago, in the late summer, I began noticing a vehicle on the road that I didn't recognize. That happens. People visit, people make wrong turns, people have reasons to be places I don't know about. I notice unfamiliar vehicles and then I identify them and file them away. This vehicle didn't file away. It was a mid-sized car, older model, a light neutral color, tan or gray. I was never certain in the available light, with a small dent in the rear panel on the driver's side that I noticed on the second sighting and used as a confirming detail afterward. It drove the road slowly. Not the slowness of someone who's lost and looking for an address. A different quality of slowness, more deliberate. The pace of someone looking at things rather than looking for something. It came through 3 times in the same week. Different times of day. Same car, same deliberate pace, same direction each time. I have a habit that I developed from Roger, who was a more observant man than most people knew. He kept a small notepad on the table by the front window, and he wrote down things he noticed on the road. Dates, times, descriptions. He said you never know what's going to matter, and writing costs nothing. After he died, I kept the habit. When I noticed the car the first time, I wrote it down. When it came back a second time, I added to the entry. When it came back a third time, I had enough for a description and a partial plate, and I went and told my neighbor Ruth, who lives 3 houses down, and who has excellent distance vision and a memory for vehicles. Ruth had seen it twice. She described the same car, the color, the slow pace, the direction. She confirmed the details. The week after, the car came back. This time it stopped. It pulled to the side of the road in front of my house, not in my driveway, on the road shoulder in front of the property, and it sat there. I was watching from the front window, and I checked the time when it stopped. 2:47 in the afternoon, I watched it. Nothing happened for several minutes. No one got out, no door opened, no window came down. The car just sat there in front of my house. There appeared to be one person inside, 9 minutes by my watch. Then the car pulled forward, turned around in the space my neighbor across the road leaves open in his driveway for exactly that purpose, and went back to the county road end and left. I called the sheriff's department that afternoon. I gave them my notes, 3 prior sightings with dates and times, the partial plate, the vehicle description, Ruth's corroboration, and the 9-minute stop in front of my property. A deputy called me back the next morning, listened to everything I could tell him, said he'd flagged the description for patrol and that I should call again if the vehicle returned. The vehicle did not come back to my road after that, at least not in any instance that I observed or that anyone on my road reported to me. About 2 months after my call to the sheriff, I was talking with a woman I know named Patsy, who lives over in the next county. Patsy mentioned that she'd had a peculiar situation at her house. A car she didn't recognize had been driving her road slowly, repeatedly, for about a week, and had stopped in front of her house one afternoon. I asked her about the vehicle, and she described something consistent with what I'd written down. Similar color, older model, similar size. She said she'd also called the sheriff's department about it. A few weeks after that, I was reading the regional newspaper, and there was a brief item about an ongoing property crime investigation in a county adjacent to both mine and Patsy's. The article mentioned that investigators were looking for a vehicle in connection with the investigation. The description given was general but not inconsistent with what I'd noted. I called the investigating officer, whose name appeared in the article, and gave them my notes. Everything I'd written down from the first sighting through the 9-minute stop. They thanked me and said it would be passed to the relevant team. No one followed up with me after that call. I have no idea what the investigation found or whether my notes were of any use to anyone. That car was looking at houses on my road. It was looking at occupied houses, family homes, homes where it could see who came and went and what the routines looked like and when people were likely to be alone. It stopped in front of my house for 9 minutes in the afternoon, and someone inside it looked at my home and thought about it and then drove away. I know that the only reason I know about any of this is because I had a habit of writing things down, because I talked to my neighbor, and because I picked up the phone. I've lived on this road for 40 years and on this county for all 73 years of my life. I've seen the community thin out in ways that have real consequences for safety, because community is what security looks like at the rural level. Community is Ruth, who'd seen the car twice and who confirmed my notes without any reason to, except that she pays attention to her road. Community is knowing which vehicles belong and which don't. The old wisdom of these communities was built around mutual observation and communication. People looked out for each other's properties because they understood that the alternative was looking out only for your own, which in terrain like this amounts to not looking out at all. Pay attention. Write it down. Talk to the people on your road. Make the phone call even when you're not certain anything is wrong, because the call costs you nothing, and the certainty may come too late to be useful. I hope this is helpful to someone. That's why I sent it in.